Professor, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure to be with you, Dmitry.
Now, you're perhaps best known for your research and your work involving the prosecution of Nazi war criminals in the Holocaust. What guided you to that area of interest?
Yeah, it's interesting. So right after college, I had a Fulbright fellowship to Germany. And it was during the time that I was on this Fulbright that I became really interested in how countries deal with legacies of atrocity. And um, and then when I started law school, I had just continued to be sort of fascinated by the way the law actually played a very valuable and important role in as a tool of dealing with these past horrific state-sponsored events. A lot of people often, there's been a lot of focus in recent years about the role that, let's say, memorials or museums play as tools for reckoning with the past of a nation. I became really just interested in the legal process itself and how criminal trials play this critical role as a way of kind of a nation's negotiating with its with some of its unsavory past moments.
Now, you hear about efforts to prosecute these war criminals all the time. A few years back, you specifically focused your efforts on John Demjanjuk. Why is that?
Well, Demjanjuk was an interesting case because I had actually started out, this is again now goes back over 2 decades. I published a book that was about the Nuremberg trial, then about the Eichmann trial. And even at the time that I was writing about the Eichmann trial, I had written very briefly about this subsequent trial that took place in Israel involving this John Ivan Demjanjuk, this native Ukrainian who had then emigrated to the United States after the Second World War, who was accused of being this particularly notorious death camp guard at Treblinka. And at the time, when I was writing about in this earlier book, I basically was describing how this Israeli trial kind of turned into a real nightmare because it ended up that the Israelis ultimately recognized that they got the wrong guy. Years later, it just coincidentally, I was a visiting professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. This was in 2009, when Demjanjuk suddenly was back in the headlines. He had just been stripped of his citizenship in the United States for the second time, and we can kind of go into the details of this bizarre legal ordeal that he went through. And he was deported to Germany to now stand trial, not on the charges that he was falsely charged with in Israel, but on charges that actually were supported by solid evidence. And so I just happened to be in Germany. I had already done some research about his earlier Israeli trial, and so I managed to play journalist. I got an assignment from Harper's Magazine to cover the trial in Munich, and then I turned that magazine assignment into a book.
Can you describe the differences between the prosecution in Israel and the subsequent one in Germany?
Yeah, so we do need to, I mean, again, it's a kind of really involved and bizarre story. So Demjanjuk, he had come to the United States, as I said, after the war in 1952. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1958. He lived basically kind of a pretty unruffled life in a suburban Cleveland. He worked as a machinist from Ford. He had a kind of nice middle-class a lifestyle. And then in the mid-70s, American prosecutors and Immigration Naturalization Service agents started becoming more interested in pursuing Nazi collaborators who had come into the United States by basically presenting false information on visas or immigration documents. And through kind of strange means, Demjanjuk ended up on their radar. And then as they started investigating Demjanjuk, evidence started to emerge that, oh, well, this wasn't just any old collaborator. This was someone who seemed to be a really notorious guard at Treblinka, someone who the few survivors of Treblinka had described as Ivan the Terrible, really someone who was like sociopathically cruel, kind of satisfying all our Hollywood images of what a SS killing center guard would be like. In this case, not an SS, but kind of a collaborative guard. And he ultimately was extradited to Israel to stand trial as this legendarily cruel guard at Treblinka. And he ultimately was convicted. He was sentenced to death in Israel. Had he been executed, he would have been only the second person ever executed in Israeli history. In fact, until today, up until now, Adolf Eichmann remains the only person ever executed in Israeli history. But during this mandatory appellate process, which happens to just coincidentally coincide with the unraveling of the Soviet Union, suddenly prosecutors and defense attorneys got access to all this information that had been kind of moldering in KGB files. And the information made pretty clear that Israel had the wrong guy, that this Ivan the Terrible was not Ivan Demjanjuk, but this Ivan Marchenko, who bore a kind of negligible but not insignificant resemblance to Demjanjuk himself. But making this whole thing into kind of a legal perfect storm, this evidence also wasn't entirely exculpatory, because it indicated that if Demjanjuk had not been Ivan the Terrible, he probably had been Ivan the Not So Hot. That is, the evidence indicated that he had been a guard at Sobibor killing center, not someone who was distinguished by his cruelty, but had served as a killing center guard. And those were the charges that he was tried for in Germany. And he was ultimately convicted. This was a trial that started in 2009, dragged on to 2011. He was ultimately convicted, and he actually died as his conviction was still under appeal.
You know, as a Soviet-born Jew whose family members have been killed and displaced by the war, I can't imagine any reasonable person making the argument that these murders should be prosecuted irrespective of how long it takes, right? I wonder if you've ever been confronted with the argument that going after these folks as they get into their 90s, sometimes beyond, perhaps misuses government resources, perhaps doesn't serve justice. Have you ever had those arguments brought before you? And if so, how do you respond to them?
Yeah, routinely. Absolutely, Dmitry. I've certainly heard those arguments. And I guess I think one of the things we need to distinguish is, I think we do need to distinguish between, let's say, trying someone, convicting them, and the level of punishment that they deserve. And to my mind, I think it's appropriate to try people even decades after participating, basically as being, in a sense, foot soldiers in genocide. It doesn't strike me that there should be any statute of limitations that applies to acts of genocide. We don't have statute of limitations applying to simple murder in this country. So it doesn't seem like if you're basically an accessory to the killing of basically hundreds of thousands of defenseless citizens, I don't see why you should be the beneficiary of some type of misplaced notion that, well, so much time has passed, what's the point of trying you? That said, I do think there's a question about, throwing someone who's, let's say, 92 years old in jail for 10 years or something like that. So I think in some sense, the most important thing is to have the symbolic statement of a conviction. And then in terms of the actual prison sentence, I'm not as convinced of the necessity of really seeing these people put in prison. But I do think it is important to make that symbolic statement that no matter how long it takes, the wheels of justice should turn to make sure that these perpetrators or accessories of genocide are ultimately brought to justice. In the case of someone like a Demjanjuk, I think he, felt sorry for himself simply because, there were a lot of, and it is true, there were a lot of people who had a much more aggressive role in Nazi genocide who escaped trial altogether. And but again, I think we can say that maybe on some level, Demjanjuk was could imagine himself as unlucky, but I don't think you can consider yourself as a victim of any kind of prosecutorial vendetta, because the fact that other people escape punishment does not in any way ameliorate your guilt.
Now, we're all familiar with all of the efforts over the years, right? Everybody's seen the books and the movies, Eichmann and Mengele and all the other folks that various countries have tried to prosecute over time. Simply as a function of the way time works, very few of these folks remain, right? What have countries done, the law enforcement arms of various countries done to find and bring to justice these folks?
Well, right now, I'd say basically, I mean, the countries that were probably the most active most recently have been probably the United States and Germany. Which is not to say, you know, in the post-war period, there were many trials that were conducted. And, you know, Poland conducted, you know, thousands of trials. I mean, a lot of these trials involve collaboration. So it very often it's very difficult to distinguish between the trials that were dealing with collaborators, Nazi regime, as opposed to trials that were dealing, let's say, specifically to the atrocities and the exterminatory policy that was directed against the Jewish population of Europe. But certainly there were trials in many trials in the Netherlands, many trials in France. As the decades passed, a lot of prosecutors turned their attention elsewhere. And the United States actually created this dedicated bureau within the Department of Justice called the Office of Special Investigations. And they were pretty aggressive and pretty successful in trying to find these collaborators, Nazi collaborators who had come to the country under false pretenses. Now, given as you know, the kind of the jurisdictional profile of these cases, American prosecutors couldn't actually bring charges for these so-called extraterritorial crimes that took place in the European theater, in which Americans were neither the perpetrators nor the victims. So what the Americans could do, though, is they could strip these people of citizenship and then send them to countries where they could be tried. So that's, for example, what happened with Demjanjuk, first when he was sent to Israel and then when he was sent to Germany. Just in the last couple of years, Germany, once Demjanjuk was convicted in 2011, German prosecutors kind of used the precedent of his conviction to then reopen cases that had really been kind of lying dormant for almost decades in German prosecutorial and investigatory files. And there have been a few convictions that have followed from that. As you point out, by necessity, there are not going to be a lot of these cases because you're talking about people who, at the youngest, are going to be in their early 90s to have any kind of complicity in these crimes. And in fact, you have this very bizarre circumstance. Recently, there was this first woman really to be convicted under this theory that was articulated in the Demjanjuk case. This Irmgard Fürchner was her name, and she was secretary to the commandant of the Stutthof camp, which is near Gdansk, now in Poland, the former Danzig. And she was convicted, and this is a woman who's, you know, in her early 90s, convicted in Germany, but she was tried as a juvenile. She was tried in juvenile court because she was basically 17 when she started her secretarial service. And so you end up having these sort of very strange kind of legal procedures and accommodations to deal with the fact that you're dealing with crimes that are just about like 80 years old now.
Yeah. Now you've written as well in connection with the law catching up to Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, a bit of a pivot from what we've been discussing. I'd like to talk to you about the ICC warrant that was issued for Vladimir Putin, something with which many agree. Is it simply a symbolic gesture, or do you see it having any real clause as time passes?
It's very hard to say. It's a really interesting question because I even remember back, you probably remember as well, with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY. And, there was a time where the ICTY, for example, issued an indictment, an arrest warrant for Slobodan Milosevic, the former, president of Serbia. And at the time, people were saying, this is just a symbolic statement. There's no way that Milosevic is ever going to end up in The Hague. In fact, many people thought that Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, who was the former president of this breakaway Republika Srpska, and also this Ratko Mladic, who was the general who was responsible for the massacre of 7,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica. All these big fish, they thought, just symbolic. They're never going to end up prosecuting them. Well, lo and behold, they ended up prosecuting all three. Now, Milosevic died before his trial ended, but Karadzic and Mladic were both convicted and are still, right now in prison. So I wouldn't say it's entirely symbolic because I think it's very difficult to predict what will happen in the future. It is true that it's kind of impossible to imagine Putin ending up in the International Criminal Court without some kind of regime change in Russia. But is it impossible to imagine some kind of regime change in Russia as the war continues to, assuming that it continues to drag on and whatever domestic support erodes? It's, very hard to say, Dmitry, but I wouldn't say it's absolutely impossible.
Now, in that same article, you discussed Donald Trump, right? And that's just a can of worms you can open forever as it relates to his legal issues. At the time you wrote that article, the only active case was the one in New York City. And that case, as well as this case that was just indicted a few days ago and on which he's appearing today, seems to have this idea, right, that it's a political prosecution. Do you think that even the perception of that is harmful to the country's morale?
Absolutely, for sure. I think the idea, the way in which he has been systematically attacking the integrity, first he was attacking the integrity of the FBI, and now he's really attacking the integrity of the federal judiciary, both the Department of Justice and the federal court system. And I think that's incredibly destructive to a nation that's committed to the rule of law under the Constitution. And what I think is also incredibly regrettable and dangerous is the fact that so many members of the Republican leadership simply fall in line with those attacks. So, even someone like, Ron DeSantis, who is, he's running against Trump for the nomination, instead of, even just being neutral, saying, look, the charges are very serious. This is a serious indictment. We'll see what happens in the court of law. Instead of that, he joins Trump in attacking this as a dark day in American history and indication that the federal law has been, weaponized in a political sense. It's really disgraceful. At least we see people like Chris Christie, standing up for legal process. And interestingly, William Barr, the former attorney general under Donald Trump himself, noting how serious and well presented that 49-page indictment is.
The problem, it seems to me, is that if you start with the premise that prosecutors have limited resources, and they all do, that's undeniable, right? You open the floodgates to these kinds of arguments, right? Because by the nature of that office, and when I say that office, I mean various prosecutorial branches around the country, they have to pick and choose, right? And they always have to choose crimes to prosecute that they deem within the public interest, and you open the door to these kinds of political prosecution arguments.
For sure. I mean, and I'm sure his defense lawyers will bring up at trial the notion of selective prosecution. My own feeling is That's not going to fly. I mean, I think and I think you know this probably even better than I do, that the kind of arguments that will really gain traction, let's say among Donald Trump's political base, are very different than the legal arguments that are going to gain traction in a federal courtroom. I don't see that argument about selective prosecution going anywhere, because there are a number of cases that you can point to of people being prosecuted for withholding national defense information, and people are actually getting pretty serious criminal penalties for having done so. And this whataboutism, the way in which, like, well, what about Joe Biden? Didn't he have classified material? Didn't they discover that he had taken some classified material? Well, again, I think we need to distinguish between someone who immediately surrenders that material when he's aware that he has it and then cooperates fully with authorities, and someone who appears, at least allegedly, has lied to the FBI, misled his own lawyers, and basically engaged in real obfuscation. So I don't know about you, but I don't see those arguments flying, at least in the courtroom. Again, they might certainly gain traction with his base.
I don't see selective prosecution flying. Depending on the legal standard that a judge applies, you may have to show actual malice and other things. I can't imagine that'll happen. I also can't imagine he'll show that these documents were declassified in some way,
Right.
and deemed personal documents. But the January 6th potential prosecution, that's an interesting one. What relationship do you think that case has with the current First Amendment precedent in this country, right? Particularly things like incitement of violence, other exceptions, right, under Brandenburg. What's your position on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. So, as we know, this is probably not the last indictment that Trump is going to face. I mean, he's arguably going to be, I mean, it looks like in August, he'll probably be indicted in Fulton County, Georgia, for interfering with the election results in that state. And then we know that he's also facing potential indictment, again, from this investigation from the Department of Justice into his activities in trying to remain in power, culminating in the riot and the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. And what's interesting about that latter investigation is whether he would be accused of incitement. As opposed, because there are a number of other things that he can be accused of also. He can certainly be accused, for example, of conspiracy, basically to defraud the United States. He can be accused of interfering with a federal proceeding, that is, with the tabulation of the electoral college votes in Congress on January 6th. So it's not necessarily the case that he would be accused of incitement itself. And I think, if I'm intuiting where you're going with the question, is, I do think the incitement prosecution could be a troubling one. That could be, the business of the Brandenburg erects, as you point out, or as you're suggesting, a very high bar. I mean, you need to demonstrate imminent lawlessness as a result of the statements that you're making. And I'm not sure if his statements necessarily rise to that bar, but I do think that federal prosecutors could nonetheless indict him on some of these other things about the way in which he tried to arrange to have false slates of electors submitted to Congress, the way in which he tried to interfere with the tabulation of the electoral college votes, some of these other things that Eastman was involved with, that some of his supporters were involved with as well. Because it wasn't just, remember, January 6th, it was really a whole concerted effort on his part to try to remain in power.
Now, obviously, you're not a politician, you're an academic. What impact do you think this will have on 2024, if any? I know there's an issue with timing and whether or not these cases will be tried prior to the election, if they're not tried prior to the election and he happens to win? I can't even imagine the chaos that would ensue then. How do you see these four? Some of them are prosecutions now, some of them are still investigations. How do you see how these cases will impact the election?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit hard to say. I guess my senses, and again, I could be obviously completely wrong about this, but we saw when he was indicted in New York with the that 34 count indictment dealing with the payment of the hush money to Stormy Daniels. We saw that he certainly got a bump in his fundraising efforts, and that certainly galvanized his base. But I do think there's a difference between the kinds of things that galvanize his base and the things that contribute to his general electability. And I do think, at least, I'm not sure if I'm confusing my hopes with my predictions, but I do think that that this will erode perceptions of his electability. Just the number of indictments that he'll be fighting off simultaneously. And, I do think there's a kind of almost collective exhaustion with him in the United States. And I think, even on the campaign trail right now, he seems to be able to do nothing except present himself as the sum of all victimization of his base. He really doesn't have much of a vision for this nation. The only vision he has is to really kind of use this apocalyptic language about, we're looking at the final battle for the United States. And I just don't see that as ultimately convincing enough Americans to make him electable should he gain the Republican nomination, which is certainly not clear at this point either.
I want to finish up by talking a bit about an article that you wrote for The Guardian entitled How the U.S. Supreme Court is Turning the Constitution into a Suicide Pact. Can you discuss that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote that. This was at the time that this is about right now the court is about to hand down a bunch of important decisions at the end of its term. And last year, we know that it handed down a bunch of very important decisions, overturning Roe v. Wade. They made a decision that seemed to that pretty dramatically expanded Second Amendment rights, their interpretation of rights to gun ownership, and they also offered they rendered a decision that basically limited the capacity of executive administrative agencies to fight climate change. And it just struck me that the Supreme Court we know that the Constitution is, a pretty open-ended document. It's pretty open-textured in a lot of clauses. I mean, things like what does due process of law mean? What does free speech mean? I mean, this is pretty open-ended stuff that requires interpretation. And it struck me that the court was interpreting this language in ways that were really kind of frustrating the political and democratic goals of lots of Americans. I mean, on one level, we live in an incredibly polarized society, incredibly polarized nation. But that said, I think it's mistaken to say that the polarization is 50-50. I think, for example, if you look at something like Roe v. Wade, 60% of Americans supported abortion rights or continue to support abortion rights. If you look at the Second Amendment, a very substantial majority of Americans support reasonable gun control. A very substantial percentage of Americans believe that human beings are contributing to climate change and that we need to have aggressive responses to it if we're going to secure a good future for our children. And I just think it's incredibly bad for this country when the Supreme Court basically interferes with the democratic process and stops elected officials from shaping reasonable responses to issues that that the majority of Americans care about deeply.
Well, it'll be interesting few months coming up here. Maybe we'll talk again. I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
And thanks for your terrific questions, Dmitry. And yeah, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, sir.